Recording. And meanwhile, why don't you guys put your names in the chat just so I know I get an idea of who's here. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is the agenda that we have for today, and we'll just get started with what CSS is. CSS stands for okay, so and we'll just start with what CSS actually is. It stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And it's the presentation layer for websites. In other words, HTML gives us the structure and content, and CSS controls how that content looks. That involves things like colors, fonts, spacing, and layout. It also helps keep content and design separate, which makes websites easier to build, update, and maintain. So you can also think of CSS as what turns a plain HTML document into something polished and visually engaging. For example, on this particular side, this rule targets the H1 elements, which changes the text color to navy, which is just a simple example of how CSS controls presentation. And now let's try to take a look at how uh, let's try to take a look at how CSS controls this. Okay, so there are like three methods where you could add CSS. First one is inline styles. They just go directly on an HTML element using the style attribute. And they are okay for quick tests, but as the application grows, they become very hard to maintain very quickly. The second method is internal style sheets. They use a style block instead of the inside the head of the HTML file. These can be useful for small projects or demos, but they don't scale well if you are working across multiple pages. And last but not least, the external style sheets are the professional standard. You put your CSS in a separate .css file and link it to your HTML document with a link tag in the head. That this keeps your code organized, reusable, and much easier to maintain. And on the right side, we can just see one simple example of how you can link an external style sheet using the link tag, which is usually placed in the head section of your HTML file, just so we could connect those styles. And now let's try to take a look at Now let's try to look at the building blocks of a CSS rules. They consist of three essential components. And those are selectors, properties, and values. Every CSS rule follows the same basic idea. Who are we targeting? What are we changing? And what are we setting it to? So the selector chooses the elements we want to style. So an element selector like P targets every paragraph on the page. A class selector like dot button targets any element with that class. And classes are what you will use most often in real projects. And an ID selector like me hashtag mean header targets one unique element, but IDs should be used sparingly because they are very specific. They are very specific. And then we also have property and the value. The property is the style attribute that we want to change, like font size or color. And the value is the setting that we assign it to, like it could, like the font size could be 20 pixels or the color could be hashtag 333. So, as you can see in this example, which is trying to set the class called welcome message by adjusting the font size to 20 pixels and the color to hashtag 333. And so, what, and then next try to talk about a particular, what happens when two CSS rules target the same element. This is where cascade and specificity comes in. The browser uses both to decide which rules mean. So, what does the cascade mean? It means that CSS is read from literally from the top to the bottom. And if two rules have the same specificity, the one that appears later in the file wins. So, specificity is like a scoring system. More specific selectors beat less specific ones. In general, IDs are more specific than classes, and classes are more specific than element selectors. So, in this example on the right, we can see that the paragraph selector sets the text color to blue. But the important text class is more specific. So the text ends up red, not blue. So this is one of the more important concepts to understand because it will save a lot of debugging as we go on later. Uh, and now about uh, let's try to talk about the box model, which is really the foundation of spacing and layout in text in CSS. Every element on a page is try to consider is like a rectangular box, and the box model defines its layers from the inside out. At the center, we have the content, which could be the actual text or the image itself. Then comes the padding, which is the space between the content and the border. A helpful way to think of it is like bubble wrap inside the box. And then we have the border, which is the invisible edge or the wall of the box. And then finally, margin is the space outside of the border, which is used for pushing other elements away. You could try to think of it as the element's personal space. So, in this example on our right, you could see that there's a card element with a padding of 20 pixels, a 1 pixel solid black border, and a margin of 15 pixels. So it has space both inside and outside its visible border. One important thing to remember is that by default, padding and border add to an element's total width. So sizing can be a little surprising at first, and so using this property called box sizing, and then setting it to border box helps makes that more predictable. And then setting it to border box would help and now let's try to look at border block versus inline elements because a lot of beginner layout confusion starts here. Block elements are like paragraphs in a document. They start on a new line and automatically take up or take up the full width available. Common examples include div, headers, and paragraph tags. Inline elements are more like words in a sentence. They do not start on a new line and they only take up as much width as they need. Common examples include the anchor tag, the span tag, and the image and the strong tag. And this is where the display property becomes very useful. It can override an element's default behavior. A good example is inline block, which gives you useful middle ground. The element still flows in line with other content, but you can also set things like width, height, padding, and background more predictably. This is why this property is often used for things like buttons, as you can see in this example on the bottom right. And now let's try to take a closer look at positioning. So this now let's try to understand what does the position property actually does. So this property controls where an element would sit on on the page, and some position values can take elements out of the normal document flow. So for most elements, static is the default. So elements will just appear in the order that they show up in the HTML. The relative value moves an element slightly from its normal position, but the original space is still reserved. The absolute removes the element from the normal flow and positions it relative to the nearest parent that has a position set. And then lastly, fixed property is useful, keeps an element locked to a specific spot in the viewport, which is useful for things like sticky headers or floating buttons. And then we have Flexbox, which is one of the most useful modern layout tools in CSS. When you set the display for any element or to flex on a parent container, its children become flexible items that are much easier to align and space out. Justify the As you can see in this example below, the justify content property handles alignment across the main axis, and align items handles items across the cross axis. So the big takeaway from this slide would be is if you ever want to use positioning, you should position it with purpose and use Flexbox to simplify layouts that would otherwise feel harder to manage. And then, as always, this if you as long as we follow all these steps, we should be able to build responsive and well-structured layouts that would adapt across screen sizes. And so here's a quick summary of what we have learned so far. CSS separates presentation from content. CSS rules are built with selectors, properties, and values. The cascade and specificity help determine which styles get applied first, and the box portal helps us understand spacing through margin, border, and padding. We also take a quick. We also took a closer, a first look at Flexbox as a powerful modern layout tool for one-dimensional alignment. And the only way that you will get comfortable with all these properties is that practice. So after the session, try to build and style a web page from scratch. For those of you who were here last week, you could try styling your own the web page that we had built in the last session, and then you could also start exploring CSS Grid for more two-dimensional layouts, and try to give some thoughts about responsive design with media queries. And so I hope that this gave you a small. I hope this gave you some idea about how HTML and CSS work as a team, and then it is always And then these concepts will be worth revisiting until they start to feel natural. And as always, you if you ever manage to um, work your way through becoming a full stack developer, then you will realize that Flexbox will be one of the layout tools that you will use most often while building out web pages. So I'll just pause here and see if and just take this time to answer any questions you have about the presentation that we just went through. Okay, so if no questions comes to mind right now, that's totally okay. We will try to revisit some of these ideas again in the live coding demo. And just give me a few minutes while I set up the VS Code again and share my screen. Okay. For this live demo, I'm just gonna be styling this simple HTML page in VS Code. So you can see how these CSS concepts work in practice. Right now, I just have a basic page structure with a heading, short intro paragraph. It's pretty much similar to the page that we had built on in the in the last session. And so we'll just use this page to practice some selectors, spacing, and some try to take a look at how different properties would come up, and and if we have some time, we will try to go a little bit into uh, a Flexbox style as well. So for now, I have just created this separate external sheet called styles.css, which will be the external style sheet connected to this HTML document. So that means that any changes we make in the CSS file will control the presentation itself without changing the HTML structure. So let's try to take a look at a classic selector. So let's just try to build out this page, styling this page a bit globally. So I'll just begin with the body selector. So now this selector applies all the properties to every single element that exists on the page. So the idea is just to set out some default styles for the whole page, like the font family, background color, text color, and just overall spacing. So let's see what can be some good. Let's go with Arial and let's try to set the background color to hashtag 333. Let's see what that color comes out to. And you know what? Instead of setting the background color, oh, this is quite a dark color. So let's just set this color to uh, this. Let's just set the text color to this one. And for the background, Let's try to go with slightly off white. And each element would have a margin of about 3 pixels. So let me save that and let's take a look at how the page looks like now. Okay, so you can see by just applying some basic properties, this already or improves the overall look of the page by giving it a clean font, softer background, and some breathing room around the edges. So let's try to set the header color to navy, and let's see what happens. So typically, the color text would be just set to navy, and let's try to align this header to the center. So after after these properties are set, we should be able to reload the page, and you can see that now I'm just targeting the H1 to make the main heading stand out a bit more. And so this is just one simple example of an element selector. Then let's try to add some styles to the paragraph. So right now you can see that the current paragraph is just a little small to as the default font size, which is a bit small. And let's try to make this more readable. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the paragraph selector and try using the font size of 18 pixels, and let's try to keep the line height to 1.6. So now since our paragraph just involves one single paragraph, the line height shouldn't make too much of a difference. But as you can see, just by increasing the font size, uh, the just by increasing the font size, this paragraph text is a bit more readable. And then the line height becomes all even more useful once this paragraph will have longer blocks of text. So now let's try to style the hobby section a little bit. So now what I can do is I could try to give this H2 a little class, which is called hobbies list. So we're just going to be using a class selector here, which would be which would have the name hobbies list. So this would be one way of targeting this particular section more specifically, instead of just you styling every H2 on that page. Okay, I'm just checking if the class is the same. Okay, so for the list of hobbies, it's actually the hobbies label. The list corresponds to these list elements, and then we will be changing those. But let's just try to do this one at a time. So for the hobbies label, let's just try to set a margin top of about 30 pixels. So what this property will do is it will just set a margin of 30 pixels from the top. And then this is one particular example of a class selector. So that is why it would usually start with top. It will only apply to the element that has the class name hobbies label, which makes it more useful, more reusable, and more precise than a plain element selector. So let's try to save our changes and just reload. Now, since we've just changed the hobby, okay, since the color changes into noticeable, let's try to change it to something that will be noticeable. Let's try to set the text to red, and then And then you can see that just the list label has been targeted, and that is one example uh, of a class selector. And then let's try to move on and try to select other out let's try to style list elements. So we could just now, since these elements are inside this section, we can we can just target them a bit more specifically with a descendant selector. So this selector, so what would is this descendant selector? It is nothing but it would try to look for it would try to find any list elements that are set with that live inside the element with the class hobbies list. So that would eventually become more useful because it lets us style only just this list and not just the and not just every single list item that exists on the page. So let's try to set the color to let's see, color to be green. Let's try green. And then let's try to set some margin. Let's try to keep the margin at the bottom to about 8 pixels. And once we save that, we can just take a closer look at what our elements look like. So right after right after we have styled these list of hobbies, you can see that only the list items under the hobby section were affected. They have a little bit more spacing, and the green color makes it easier to see that our descendant selector is working exactly where we want it to. And now let's try to style these links at the bottom. So right now they're just using the browser's default link setting. So this is a good chance to make it more cleaner. So what we could do is we could use another example of the descendant selector where we could just type out the class called links, and another way to select those uh, those anchor tags would be just to add the anchor tags. So this is how now what I'm just doing here is I'm just trying to change the color to let's see, what color would you guys want? Can anybody name a color? Okay, let's change it to yellow and see what happens. And then let's keep the text decoration to none, just so that there won't be any underline at all. And then we could just keep the margin right to be at 10 pixels. And let's try to add a small event, which is usually represented the uh, by the hover class. So what does this what this would do is that this is an example of a pseudo class. So the pseudo class lets us style an element in a particular state, and hover would apply when the user would place their mouse over this element. So so if I try to set the text decoration to underline, you will see that once we navigate to those links, the text decoration would change from none to underline. And now let's try to refresh our page and take a look at what it looks like. Okay, Okay, let's try to change this color just so you can see the underline link. Okay, let's set it to orange link. Uh, Now, while yellow is a fun test color, but since the background is a little light, so it may not be very readable. So let's try changing this color to pink. I feel like this would be a good one. So, and that would also help us and establish better contrast. Okay, that is much better. So now you can see that when I hover on these links, you can see that the text decoration changes from none to underline. And so let's try to make this section a bit more structured by using Flexbox for the links. Right now, they're just sitting next to each other naturally, but with Flexbox, it would allow us to give more control over alignment and spacing. So let's try to set that up. Since these links are in a class called links, so we will be using this class selector after all. And just to set up since they are the parent container, we'll be setting up the display property to be flex. And let's try to add a gap of 15 pixels. And let's try to align these items in the center. So by setting the parent container to display files, the anchor tags become flex items, and the gap property adds consistent space between them. And this align items property helps control their alignment within the row itself. So let's refresh the page and take a closer look at how our links look now. And as you can see right now, they just look like they're laid out in a more intentional way. So in this case, the visual change may seem subtle, but Flexbox becomes especially helpful once you have more items that need more control over spacing and alignment. So we have we have uh, we have one big container. So let's try to style this up by using the Flexbox that we just took a look at. So this is a really common pattern because it gives us one element to control the page width, center the content, and add some internal spacing. So let's try to uh, add some styling to our big container itself. Let's set the max width to 700 pixels, and then let's add a little bit of margin. Let's say 40 pixels auto, and then we'll just add some padding about 20 pixels, and then let's add some background color just so we could understand the differences. And then let's set some border radius of about 8 pixels. So the max width property keeps the content from stretching too wide on larger screens. Margin with auto centers the container horizontally, and then the padding adds space inside, and the white background helps separate the content from the page background. And so let's try to refresh this and see what this looks like. And now you can see with just a little bit of styling, this helps us. This page already looks much more polished and structured. We haven't, as you can see, we haven't really changed the HTML content itself. We've just improved the presentation layer, which is exactly the role of CSS in general. So this demo really ties back to the main ideas from the presentation. We used an external style sheet. We applied selectors, properties, and values. And we also worked with spacing through margin and padding. And we also used a little bit of Flexbox to improve layout and alignment. So I feel like this is a I feel like this is a good place to stop for now. I'll just pause for a moment and see if you guys have any questions so far about the coding about this demo or the presentation that we just went through.
Could you please show the VX code just for a little bit again?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Could you please show VS code, the code, one more time?
Yeah, I'll just show this code one more time. So we've just set up a simple HTML star folder where we file where we have created a small introduction page, and then we also applied individual styles that made the page look from this, and then finally the once all the styling was applied, the page somewhat became like this. And don't worry about the code. This will all be shared to you, including the presentation and the recording as well. Do you have to use the word Flexbox in order to use it? How does it know to use it? Well, you do not need to use the value flex, but no, you need to use the value flex, not the word flexbox by itself in your HTML. So the flexbox is the name of the layout system. To activate it in HTML, you simply apply display flex to a parent container. So, for example, if I just write for the example that we've just seen, this tells the browser to treat everything inside the links div as flex items. The browser knows to use Flexbox because of this rule that we just set. So once that is set on the parent, the child elements automatically follow the Flexbox layout behavior. Oh, okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. That's if you don't have any questions, that's totally fine. I realize that this is a relatively new concept, and this is something that you will eventually get comfortable with more practice, and that is what I would recommend as well. So just keep practicing, and I would probably say that if you have any other questions outside like after this session, you can always reach out to me on Slack, or you can just try to schedule a one-on-one call, and I'll be sure to make address all of your concerns that you have about the particular course. And also, I will make sure that the slides and the sample code and and the recording are shared so that you can review everything afterwards. So now, so just give me a few moments while I record today's attendance.